was handsome. He was educated. He spoke with confidence, carried himself with charm, and made people feel at ease. In the 1970s, Ted Bundy was the kind of man parents wanted their daughters to meet. Polite, well-dressed, ambitious. He worked in politics, studied law, and volunteered on crisis hotlines. To the outside world, he was intelligent, caring, and charismatic. But behind the bright smile, behind the polished exterior, lived a side of Bundy that no one suspected. A side that would leave young women across America vanishing into thin air. A side that would shock the nation, because evil didn't look like a monster. It looked like the boy next door. This is the story of Ted Bundy, the handsome monster who fooled America. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His beginnings were shrouded in secrecy and confusion. He was raised believing his mother was his sister, and his grandparents were his parents. His real father was never identified. For the first years of his life, Bundy lived with his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell. Samuel, by many accounts, was strict, controlling, and sometimes violent. Eleanor, on the other hand, was deeply religious, quiet, and submissive. By the time Ted was 4 years old, his mother Louise took him and moved to Tacoma, Washington. There, she married Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook who legally adopted Ted. But Ted never fully accepted Johnny as his father. He felt abandoned, unwanted, and different from the world around him. In school, Ted appeared intelligent but introverted. Teachers described him as a good student, but socially awkward. He struggled to form deep friendships. What few saw, even then, was his fascination with control. Bundy admitted later that from an early age, he secretly developed obsessions with violent imagery and fantasies of dominance. These thoughts, though hidden behind his quiet exterior, began shaping the man he would become. By the time he reached high school and college, Bundy had crafted what would become his greatest weapon, his mask of charm. Outwardly, he was polite, well-groomed, and respectful. He joined clubs, attended dances, and appeared socially normal. But beneath the surface, he remained distant. Friends later described him as difficult to truly know. He smiled easily, but it rarely reached his eyes. In the late 1960s, Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound, then transferred to the University of Washington, where he studied psychology. Ironically, while learning about the human mind in class, he was already perfecting his ability to manipulate people outside it. During this period, he began dating a young woman from a wealthy California family, often referred to under the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks. She was elegant, educated, and represented everything Bundy wanted: class, money, and social standing. But when Stephanie ended the relationship in 1969, Bundy was devastated. To him, it wasn't just heartbreak. It was rejection, humiliation, and a blow to his ego. Friends recall how Bundy became determined to prove himself. He refocused his life, re-enrolled in school, and began volunteering for political campaigns. He worked on a crisis hotline where colleagues, including future true crime author and Rule, remembered him as empathetic and attentive. On the outside, Bundy seemed transformed into a young man with promise. Inside, however, a storm was brewing. To understand Ted Bundy is to understand manipulation. Bundy was not a man who intimidated with fear. He drew people in. He made women trust him. He used his smile, his intelligence, and his confidence as weapons. Psychologists later described him as a mask of sanity. He could appear kind, attentive, even heroic. Yet beneath that mask was emptiness, a profound lack of empathy. This duality allowed him to exist in two worlds. One where he studied law, volunteered, and dated women. Another where he cultivated dark fantasies of control, domination, and erasing lives. The rejection he faced from Stephanie Brooks seemed to intensify his inner drive. Bundy became obsessed with women who resembled her. Young, educated, long hair parted in the middle. This pattern would later be seen in the lives that were cut short under his deception. Although Bundy presented himself as ambitious and hardworking, those close to him sometimes sensed something unusual. Neighbors described him as distant, someone who could be polite in one moment and cold in another. A college professor once noted that Ted seemed brilliant, but strangely detached, as though watching the world rather than engaging with it. Bundy himself admitted later that his desires for control were growing stronger during these years. He spent hours following strangers, studying their routines, imagining scenarios of dominance. He learned to disguise himself not just in personality, but in appearance. Glasses, slings, fake casts, crutches. He experimented with props that could make him look vulnerable, approachable, or trustworthy. To the outside world, these were quirks of an ambitious law student. To Bundy, they were rehearsals for the life he was about to lead. In early 1974, young women in the Pacific Northwest began to disappear. Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old University of Washington student, vanished from her home in February. Her room showed signs of disturbance, bed covers neatly arranged to hide the absence beneath. By spring and summer, the disappearances multiplied. Donna Manson, a 19-year-old student, was gone by March. April claimed Susan Rancourt, another student who never returned to her dorm. Then in July, on a single day at Lake Sammamish State Park, two young women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, vanished within hours of each other. Witnesses described a man named Ted who approached women with his arm in a sling, asking for help loading a sailboat. He was polite, well-dressed, handsome. No one suspected danger. But behind the charming facade, their lives were about to be cut short. By the end of 1974, panic had swept across college campuses in Washington state. Young women vanished without explanation. Police had no solid leads. Witnesses only described a man, attractive, confident, well-spoken, who introduced himself simply as Ted. And as fear grew, so too did the legend of this unknown predator. What no one realized yet was that Ted Bundy, the smiling law student, the political volunteer, the attentive crisis hotline worker, was living a double life. A life where charm was a weapon. A life where trust became a trap. And in the years ahead, his deception would spread across the country. For more true crime documentaries like this one, click the subscribe button and never miss a case. It was the early months of 1974 when fear began to quietly creep through Washington state. On college campuses, young women started to vanish. At first, these disappearances seemed isolated, tragic but unconnected. But within months, a pattern would emerge. The man behind it all was not a faceless monster. He was someone who looked like he belonged. He was educated, well-spoken, even admired. And when he approached, few suspected they were stepping into a trap. On the morning of February 1st, 1974, the University of Washington campus woke up to unsettling news. Linda Ann Healy, 21 years old, had vanished from her home. Linda was a bright, responsible young woman. She studied psychology, had a strong social circle, and even worked as a radio announcer for a local station. She was not the kind of person who simply disappeared without a trace. When her roommates entered her room that morning, they noticed something strange. Her bed looked neatly made, but under the covers, her pillowcase and sheets were stained with blood. Her clothes from the previous night were folded and placed aside. Her backpack and bicycle were still there. But Linda was gone. There was no forced entry, no obvious struggle. It was as if someone had entered quietly, subdued her, and walked her out of the house while others slept. Police began investigating, but without witnesses or evidence, the case went cold almost immediately. No one knew then that Linda would be the first known name in a string of disappearances that would haunt the Pacific Northwest. Over the next few months, more young women disappeared in a chillingly similar fashion. Donna Gail Manson, 19, a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, disappeared on March 12, 1974. She was last seen walking across campus to attend a concert. She never arrived. On April 17, 1974, Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, a student at Central Washington State University, was last seen heading to her dorm after attending an evening event. Witnesses later recalled seeing a man on campus, wearing a sling and asking women for help carrying books to his car. In May, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, disappeared from Oregon State University after leaving her dorm to meet a friend for coffee. Each young woman was bright, responsible, and had no reason to run away. Their lives were cut short before they truly began. The community was stunned. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Friends traveled in pairs. Doors were locked, routines changed. And yet, the disappearances continued. Ted Bundy's method was calculated, rehearsed, and devastatingly effective. He often approached women in broad daylight, dressed neatly and carrying props. A sling on his arm, crutches, sometimes a stack of books or a set of car keys. He pretended to be injured or struggling. With his charm, he would politely ask for help, perhaps loading something into his car, perhaps carrying something across the street. To most women, he seemed safe. He wasn't threatening, aggressive, or strange. He was handsome, confident, and appeared vulnerable. Once they agreed to help, he led them to his Volkswagen Beetle. From there, the facade ended, and the women were never seen alive again. This tactic, simple but powerful, played on empathy. Bundy weaponized kindness. He relied on the willingness of good people to assist someone in need, and that trust cost lives. The summer of 1974 brought Bundy's boldest act yet. On July 14, 1974, Lake Sammamish State Park was packed with thousands of people enjoying a sunny day. Amid the crowd, witnesses noticed a young man with his arm in a sling. He introduced himself as Ted. He was polite, clean-cut, and confident. He approached women, asking for help loading a small sailboat onto his car. Some refused. Others agreed. By the end of the day, 2 women, Janice Ott, 23, and Denise Naslin, 19, had disappeared. This was different from previous cases. This time, Bundy acted in public, in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses. He was bold, fearless, and confident in his ability to blend in. Dozens of people later reported seeing him, a handsome young man, speaking politely, using the name Ted, and driving a Volkswagen Beetle. For investigators, this was the first real breakthrough. A name, a car, a description. But with no centralized system to share information across states in the 1970s, the leads were slow to connect. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued. By the end of 1974, at least 6 young women had vanished across Washington and Oregon. Police struggled to reassure the public. They insisted they were investigating. They increased patrols and followed up on tips. But the truth was grim. They had little evidence, no suspects, and a growing number of families left without answers. The fear spread across campuses. Young women cut their hair short, stopped parting it in the middle, and avoided walking alone. Some dropped out of school entirely. The idea that someone was preying on them was terrifying enough. But the greater fear was that this someone was hiding in plain sight. A man who looked ordinary, even attractive, who spoke with confidence and knew how to win trust. For the first time, America began to understand that evil doesn't always look like a stranger in the shadows. Sometimes, it looks like the boy next door. Psychologists who later studied Bundy noted that his actions in 1974 revealed a dangerous mix of arrogance and control. Unlike other predators who hid in darkness, Bundy operated in daylight. He relied on his ability to manipulate rather than force. His confidence grew with each disappearance. The pattern of women he targeted, young, slender, long hair parted in the middle, was striking. Many bore a resemblance to his former girlfriend, Stephanie Brooks, who had once rejected him. To Bundy, each disappearance seemed to fill a twisted need to reassert control, to rewrite his story of rejection. But instead of healing his wounds, it only fueled his desire for more. Even as these disappearances mounted, Ted Bundy's public life continued without interruption. He worked at a suicide hotline alongside Ann Rule, who would later write a best-selling book about him, never suspecting the double life he led. She recalled how compassionate and attentive Ted seemed when answering desperate calls. He volunteered in political campaigns, earning praise for his energy and commitment. He even shook hands with prominent politicians, blending into circles of power. Friends described him as charming, ambitious, and trustworthy. Women admired his looks and confidence. Men saw him as intelligent and capable. All the while, Bundy's private life was spiraling into darkness. By the close of 1974, fear had overtaken the Pacific Northwest. Young women were disappearing at an alarming rate. Police had little more than a description: a handsome man named Ted, driving a Volkswagen. It was a lead, but it wasn't enough. Bundy's confidence was growing. His mask was intact. His charm was unquestioned. And as the calendar turned to 1975, he was ready to take his deception beyond Washington, spreading his acts of destruction across multiple states, leaving investigators chasing shadows. By the start of 1975, the Pacific Northwest was on edge. Young women had been vanishing for a year, and whispers of a predator moved through college dorms and coffee shops. The name Ted and the image of a Volkswagen Beetle floated in conversations like shadows that wouldn't go away. But even as Washington investigators struggled to piece together fragments of the puzzle, the man behind the disappearances was already on the move. Ted Bundy had relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, to attend law school. He blended in effortlessly, the charming student, the attentive friend, the polite neighbor. What no one realized was that he had simply shifted his hunting ground. Not long after his arrival, young women in Utah began to disappear. In October 1974, Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the Midvale police chief, vanished while walking home from a friend's house. She never made it. Just weeks later, Laura Am, 17, disappeared on Halloween night. Friends assumed she was attending parties. When she didn't return, fear spread through her community. The disappearances in Utah bore the same signature as those in Washington. Bright, promising young women vanishing into silence. Lives cut short by someone who looked trustworthy. Bundy's confidence grew with every successful deception. He shifted between states, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, weaving a trail of despair that investigators could not yet connect. By early 1975, law enforcement began to realize the disappearances across multiple states were not isolated. Detectives from Washington, Utah, and Colorado began comparing notes. The similarities were undeniable. Young women, often students, last seen alone, usually near a campus, approached by a man feigning injury or needing help, driving a Volkswagen Beetle. For the first time, the idea of a serial predator emerged in investigators' minds. But without today's technology, coordinating across state lines was painfully slow. Witnesses described the man as handsome, polite, and confident. Some recalled his name as Ted. Others remembered his arm in a sling. But in the 1970s, databases were limited, and leads piled higher than evidence. In early 1975, Bundy turned his attention to Colorado. On January 12th, Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse, disappeared from a hotel in Snowmass Village while on a ski trip. She left her room briefly to fetch a magazine. She never returned. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the quiet mountain community. Once again, there was no forced entry, no clear struggle, no witnesses. By March, another young woman, Julie Cunningham, 26, vanished while walking to a tavern in Vail. Then in April, Denise Oliverson, 25, disappeared in Grand Junction while riding her bicycle. And in June, Susan Curtis, 15, vanished after attending a youth conference at Brigham Young University. The geography was widening, but the pattern was the same. Bundy watched, selected, and deceived. For investigators, the frustration mounted. Different states, different police departments, and no central system made linking the cases a nightmare. Even as his private life spiraled into predation, Bundy's public life remained pristine. In Salt Lake City, he dated women, attended law school classes, and maintained friendships. He was known as charming, intelligent, and ambitious. To his girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer, who had been with him since 1969, Ted was attentive and affectionate, though at times distant. Elizabeth would later recall moments when his behavior raised questions. Items disappearing, late-night absences, strange moods. But Bundy was skilled at reassurance. He laughed off suspicions, charmed away doubts, and reinforced the image of the loving partner. No one in his immediate circle believed he was capable of ending lives. Bundy's arrogance grew, but so did police attention. In August 1975, a patrol officer in Utah spotted a suspicious Volkswagen Beetle. Inside was Ted Bundy. The officer noted how Bundy seemed nervous. A quick search revealed disturbing items. A ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, ropes. Bundy insisted these were just tools, nothing unusual. But investigators were not convinced. He was taken into custody, and suddenly, the charming law student found himself facing scrutiny. When his photo was circulated, Witnesses from Washington and Utah recognized him. Women recalled being approached by a man named Ted, driving a Volkswagen with an arm in a sling. The mask was starting to crack. Around this time, Bundy's girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, contacted police. For years, she had quietly suspected something was wrong. She noticed strange items in his apartment: plaster casts, ropes, knives. She recalled how Bundy sometimes left in the middle of the night with no explanation. Elizabeth told police she feared her boyfriend might be connected to the disappearances. Her courage added fuel to the investigation. But with limited evidence and Bundy's skill at presenting himself as innocent, prosecutors struggled to build a case strong enough to hold. As investigators dug deeper, a psychological portrait of Bundy began to form. He was intelligent, articulate, and manipulative. He thrived on control and deception. His ability to charm people made him both dangerous and difficult to catch. FBI profilers described him as a man who lived behind a mask of normalcy. He created the image of a caring boyfriend, a diligent student, a friendly neighbor. But behind the mask was a predator who viewed people as objects, not lives. Each disappearance was not just an act of violence, but an affirmation of his power. Despite Bundy's ability to evade suspicion, investigators pressed forward. In 1977, he was extradited to Colorado to face charges related to the disappearance of Karen Campbell. For the first time, Bundy stood in a courtroom as a suspect in one of the most chilling series of disappearances in American history. Yet, even in custody, Bundy's cunning would soon astonish investigators. Ted Bundy was no longer just a name whispered on college campuses. He was now a man in handcuffs, facing trial. But Bundy was never one to accept limits. He was calculating, patient, and he saw opportunities where others saw confinement. Inside a Colorado courthouse, he would soon pull off a daring escape, one that shocked investigators and reminded America that the handsome monster was far from finished. In early 1977, Ted Bundy faced his first serious legal battle. Extradited to Colorado, he was charged in connection with the disappearance and demise of Karen Campbell, the young nurse who vanished from a Snowmass Village hotel in 1975. For investigators, this was a breakthrough moment. After years of fear and confusion, they finally had a man in custody who matched witness descriptions, owned the Volkswagen, and carried the tools that lined up with accounts from survivors. But Bundy wasn't the kind of man who would quietly sit in a cell and await justice. He thrived on control, on manipulation, on believing he was always one step ahead. And in June 1977, he proved just how far he was willing to go. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was escorted to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. The courtroom was quiet, the judge presiding as attorneys prepared their arguments. Unlike most defendants, Bundy was allowed to move freely in the library section of the courthouse to review law books. Guards assumed this was harmless. After all, he was studying law and representing himself. What they didn't know was that Bundy had been preparing for weeks. While left alone, he opened a window on the second floor, slipped out, and jumped into the alley below. Just like that, the most notorious suspect in America was gone. For 6 days, Bundy remained free, hiding in the mountains near Aspen. He stole food, navigated trails, and tried to stay out of sight. But exhaustion and poor planning worked against him. On June 13th, police spotted him, thin and tired, wandering near the outskirts of town. He was captured and returned to custody. The world was stunned. A man accused of ending so many lives had simply walked out of a courthouse window. But Bundy wasn't finished. Back in custody, Bundy was transferred to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Officials believed they had learned their lesson. This time, security would be tighter. But Bundy was patient. He studied routines, observed guards, and planned meticulously. In December 1977, just 6 months after his first escape, Bundy carried out his boldest plan yet. He had gradually lost weight, allowing him to squeeze through a small hole he had cut in the ceiling of his cell. One night, he slipped through the hole, crawled into the jailer's apartment above, stole clothes, and walked out the front door. By the time guards realized he was gone, Bundy was already on the road. This time, there would be no quick recapture. Bundy fled first to Chicago, then boarded a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan. From there, he drifted, stealing cars, using false identities, and blending into college towns. Eventually, he made his way south, landing in Florida in January 1978. By now, Bundy was living entirely on the run. He had no steady income, no secure place to stay. He shoplifted, stole credit cards, and moved constantly. But with freedom came the return of his compulsion. Bundy could not resist his old habits. And in Tallahassee, Florida, the mask of charm would finally shatter. On the night of January 15, 1978, just weeks after arriving in Florida, Bundy slipped into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Inside, dozens of young women slept peacefully, unaware of the predator moving silently through the halls. What followed was one of the most shocking events in American true crime history. In a matter of minutes, Bundy claimed the lives of Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20. Two other women, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were brutally attacked but survived. The violence was swift, chaotic, and unlike Bundy's earlier, more calculated acts. It shocked investigators, not only for its brutality, but for its recklessness. For the first time, Bundy wasn't hiding in the shadows or luring victims one by one. He was striking boldly, in a house full of witnesses, as if daring the world to catch him. 3 weeks later, Bundy's actions claimed another life. On February 9, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from her middle school in Lake City, Florida. She never came home that day. Kimberly was kind, bright, and full of promise. Her loss devastated her family and community. By now, Bundy had crossed a line, from targeting college women to taking the life of a child. The nation was horrified. Police intensified their search. Bundy was now one of the most wanted men in America. On February 15, 1978, Bundy was pulled over by police in Pensacola, Florida. He was driving a stolen car, resisting arrest with desperate energy. Officers subdued him, handcuffed him, and placed him in custody. When asked his name, he first refused to give it. But once fingerprinted, his identity was revealed. Ted Bundy, the man who had escaped twice, the man who had deceived for years, was finally captured again. This time, there would be no escape. By the time Bundy reached Florida, his actions had become more chaotic, reckless, and desperate. Psychologists later suggested that his repeated escapes, combined with years of deception, had created a sense of invincibility. He believed he could outsmart anyone, manipulate any situation, and bend the world to his will. But his time in Florida revealed something different. The once calm, calculated predator had transformed into a man spiraling out of control. The mask was slipping. The monster beneath was fully visible. Ted Bundy was finally back in custody, but his story was far from over. In Florida, he would face a courtroom unlike any America had seen before. Cameras would capture his every move. Journalists would broadcast his charm, his arrogance, and his defiance to the world. And in the process, Bundy would turn his trial into a spectacle. The first trial of the century for a man whose handsome mask had fooled so many. By 1978, America had learned the name Ted Bundy. He was no longer just a whisper on campuses or a headline in local newspapers. He was a man accused of a string of disappearances across the country, a man who had escaped custody not once, but twice, and a man now facing charges for the chilling events in Florida. The Chi Omega sorority house tragedy and the disappearance of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach had placed Bundy at the center of one of the most shocking cases in U.S. history. And this time, there would be no quiet courtroom tucked away in the mountains of Colorado. This time, the world was watching. The first of Bundy's Florida trials began in June 1979 in Miami. He was charged with the violent acts at the Chi Omega sorority house, where 2 young women lost their lives and 2 others survived brutal assaults. From the moment proceedings began, the trial was unlike anything America had seen. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom, broadcasting every word, every gesture, every glance of the man accused. Viewers across the country tuned in to watch. Newspapers published daily updates. Television anchors spoke his name night after night. For the first time, the legal system itself became a stage, and Ted Bundy, ever the manipulator, treated it as his performance. Despite being offered experienced legal counsel, Bundy insisted on representing himself. It was a decision born not of strategy, but of ego. He relished the idea of questioning witnesses, cross-examining survivors, and sparring with prosecutors. He saw the courtroom as an arena where he could display his intelligence, his charm, and his control. At times, Bundy sat beside his defense team. At other times, he stood alone, pacing confidently, addressing the jury with practiced ease. Observers noted how he smiled at the cameras, cracked jokes with bailiffs, and even flirted with reporters. For Bundy, this was not a trial. It was a performance. Despite Bundy's theatrics, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark impressions matched his dental records to injuries found on one of the Chi Omega victims. Witnesses described seeing Bundy near the sorority house on the night of the tragedy. Survivors who had fought for their lives identified him in court. Fibers from the crime scene matched those found in Bundy's car. Bundy attempted to challenge each piece of evidence, using his legal knowledge to question the process, the reliability, and the witnesses themselves. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that his charm could not erase the weight of facts. What truly set the Chi Omega trial apart was the media spectacle. For the first time, millions of Americans could watch a courtroom trial live on television. The image of Bundy, handsome, articulate, smiling at cameras while accused of horrific acts, fascinated and horrified viewers. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Some came seeking justice. Others came out of morbid curiosity. And disturbingly, many came to see Bundy himself. One of the strangest aspects of the Bundy trial was the following he attracted among young women. Day after day, groups of women filled the courtroom, sitting in the front rows, watching intently as Bundy spoke. Some even smiled and waved at him. They described him as attractive, misunderstood, even charming. Some believed he was innocent, convinced the state had framed him. Others admitted they were drawn to the danger, the thrill of being close to someone so infamous. Psychologists later explained this phenomenon as hybristophilia, the attraction to those who commit violent acts. But in 1979, it shocked America. How could anyone admire a man on trial for such crimes? How could anyone look at Bundy and see anything but devastation? Yet for many, Bundy's mask of charm remained intact. In a bizarre twist, Bundy used his trial not only to defend himself, but also to secure a form of companionship. During the proceedings, Bundy proposed to Carol and Boone, a woman who had moved to Florida to be near him. He did so in open court, in front of the cameras, during testimony. By citing Florida law, which recognized declarations of marriage in court when made before a judge, Bundy turned the trial into a wedding. Boone accepted, smiling as the cameras captured the moment. For the victims' families, it was a cruel spectacle. For Bundy, it was another opportunity to control the narrative and keep attention firmly on himself. On July 24, 1979, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. The courtroom erupted, some in relief, others in shock. Bundy sat motionless, his face betraying little emotion. Moments later, he was sentenced to death for the Chi Omega case. But even this was not the end. Bundy still faced another trial, one that would center on the life of a child, Kimberly Leach. In 1980, Bundy was tried for the abduction and demise of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, the middle school student taken from her campus in Lake City, Florida. For prosecutors, this case carried immense weight. While the Chi Omega trial had shocked the nation, the loss of a child struck an even deeper chord. Evidence linked Bundy to the case: fibers, eyewitness testimony, and his movements on the day Kimberly vanished. Bundy once again insisted on taking part in his defense, cross-examining witnesses, and addressing the jury directly. He smiled, joked, and maintained his act of confidence. But this time, his charm fell flat. The jury listened to testimony from Kimberly's friends, her teachers, and her family. They saw the grief etched into the faces of those who loved her. Bundy could not charm his way out of the truth. On February 10, 1980, Bundy was found guilty in the Kimberly Leach case. He received another death sentence. Together, the Chi Omega and Kimberly Leach trials cemented Bundy's place in history. They were the first nationally televised trials of their kind, setting the stage for future courtroom spectacles. They revealed not only the facts of Bundy's actions, but also his ability to manipulate perception, to use charm as a weapon even in the face of overwhelming evidence. For America, these trials became more than legal proceedings. They became a cultural moment, a confrontation between appearance and reality, between the smiling law student and the darkness he hid. Experts who observed Bundy during the trials noted striking behaviors. His calm demeanor, even while hearing graphic testimony. His tendency to look directly into cameras, as if addressing an audience. His ability to oscillate between legal professionalism and casual charm. To many psychologists, Bundy was the embodiment of narcissistic personality disorder, grandiose, manipulative, lacking empathy, and obsessed with control. For jurors, the contrast between Bundy's polished image and the devastation he caused was unsettling. He was proof that danger can wear a friendly face. Throughout the trials, the voices of victims' families echoed in courtrooms and beyond. Parents, siblings, and friends spoke of the bright futures cut short, the empty places at dinner tables, the laughter that would never return. For them, Bundy's theatrics were not entertainment. They were salt in wounds that would never fully heal. And while verdicts and sentences brought some relief, the pain of loss remained. Outside the courtroom, America debated. Some saw Bundy as proof of the importance of profiling and better coordination across law enforcement agencies. Others fixated on his charisma, his intelligence, his apparent contradiction. Television networks replayed footage endlessly. Newspapers ran front-page stories. Bundy became a household name, a symbol of how appearances can deceive. Even abroad, the world watched in fascination and horror. By 1980, Ted Bundy had been sentenced to death twice. His charm had failed him, his performances had not swayed the jury, and justice was closing in. But Bundy was not finished with his games. From his cell on death row, he would continue to manipulate, deceive, and seek attention. And in the years ahead, his final confessions would stun investigators and families alike. By 1980, Ted Bundy sat inside a Florida prison with not one, but 2 death sentences looming over him. The charming law student, the political volunteer, the so-called boy next door, had been unmasked for the world to see. But even on death row, Bundy refused to fade quietly into the background. He was housed at Florida State Prison in Rayford, confined to a small cell with the clock ticking toward execution. Yet Bundy still craved attention, still played games with investigators, journalists, and even strangers who wrote him letters. He became a manipulator of time, stalling, delaying, teasing confessions while holding back just enough to keep the spotlight on himself. For Bundy, the prison cell was not an end. It was another stage. During his trial years, Bundy had married Carol and Boone in open court. She had been one of his most devoted supporters, insisting on his innocence, moving to Florida to be near him. On death row, she remained by his side for years, visiting, writing letters, and even giving birth to a daughter, fathered during Bundy's incarceration under mysterious circumstances. For Boone, Bundy was not the monster the world saw. He was her husband, her partner, the father of her child. But by the mid-1980s, even Carol began to see cracks in the mask. Bundy's charm couldn't cover the mounting evidence, the endless appeals, or the strange games he played with investigators. Eventually, she stopped visiting. She filed for divorce, taking their daughter with her, leaving Bundy increasingly isolated. The man who once fooled women into devotion was finally abandoned by the one who believed in him most. As the years dragged on, Bundy faced mounting pressure. Families of the women, whose lives were cut short, wanted answers. Investigators wanted closure to connect the dots across states. Journalists wanted the final word from Bundy himself. Bundy played them all. He gave interviews where he admitted some involvement, but withheld details. He teased knowledge of disappearances in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, without offering clarity. At times, he claimed he couldn't remember. At other times, he insisted he didn't want to cause more pain to families. But the truth was simpler. Bundy knew that as long as he held secrets, people would need him. He believed his knowledge could delay his execution. By 1989, time had run out. Bundy's final appeals had been denied. His execution was scheduled for January 24, 1989. In the days leading up to that date, Bundy finally began to open up. He spoke to investigators from multiple states, providing details about the lives he had ended. He admitted to more than 30 victims, though the true number remains unknown. He described his method of deception, how he feigned injury, how he lured women with charm and props, how he used their trust against them. His confessions were chilling not for their detail alone, but for the calm, matter-of-fact way he delivered them. There was no remorse, no emotion, only the satisfaction of control, even in his final hours. For the families of victims, the confessions brought both relief and torment. Relief in finally knowing what had happened. Torment in hearing Bundy's cold recounting of their loved one's final moments. On the eve of his execution, Bundy gave a widely broadcast interview where he blamed violent pornography for fueling his actions. Many saw this as Bundy's final attempt at manipulation, deflecting blame, shaping his narrative, and controlling public perception even as the clock ran down. But for criminologists and investigators, the interview revealed something deeper. Bundy's need to remain in control of the story until the very end. The day arrived. Outside Florida State Prison, crowds gathered long before sunrise. Some held signs demanding justice. Others held signs reading, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Vendors sold t-shirts and hot dogs. It was a bizarre scene, part protest, part carnival, part vigil. Inside the prison, Bundy's demeanor shifted. The confident law student, the smiling courtroom performer, the man who once charmed and manipulated so many, now appeared pale, withdrawn, and anxious. At 7:06 a.m., Ted Bundy was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses filled the observation room. Reporters held pens ready to capture his final moments. Bundy looked through the glass at the witnesses. For once, there was no smile, no wink, no attempt at charm. Asked for final words, Bundy quietly said, "I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." Moments later, the sentence was carried out. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy's life ended. Outside the prison, a cheer erupted from the crowd. Some wept with relief. Others sang. The world had finally closed the chapter on one of its most infamous predators. With Bundy's death, families of the victims were left with mixed emotions. Justice had been served, but their daughters, sisters, and friends were never coming back. For law enforcement, Bundy's case reshaped the way investigations were handled. It highlighted the need for cooperation across states, the development of centralized databases, and the importance of psychological profiling. For criminologists, Bundy became a case study in narcissism, manipulation, and the chilling duality of charm and cruelty. For society, his story was a stark reminder. Danger does not always wear a frightening face. Sometimes it smiles, speaks politely, and seems like the man you'd trust without hesitation. Ted Bundy left behind more than grief and devastation. His story reshaped American culture. Parents warned daughters about strangers who seemed too friendly. Universities reinforced safety measures for women on campuses. The FBI expanded its behavioral science unit, using Bundy's case to better understand psychological profiles of serial predators. Books, films, and documentaries kept Bundy's story alive, not to glorify him, but to warn future generations that evil can hide in plain sight. Even decades later, Bundy's name evokes unease. His face, once considered handsome, now symbolizes betrayal. Bundy's life was a paradox. He had intelligence, opportunity, education, and charm. He could have lived a productive life, become a lawyer, a politician, perhaps even a respected leader. But beneath the surface, he chose a path of deceit, destruction, and manipulation. In the end, Bundy was not the charming law student, nor the promising young man many believed he was. He was a predator who used trust as a weapon, who smiled as he deceived, who lived a double life until the very last day. He walked among friends. He worked on hotlines, helping strangers in despair. He shook hands with politicians. He smiled at neighbors. And yet, behind the mask, he was one of the darkest figures America had ever known. Ted Bundy's story is not one of fascination. It is one of deception. It is one of shattered families and lives cut short. It is a warning that evil does not always announce itself with rage or menace. Sometimes, it looks like the man next door. Sometimes, it looks like the boy you trusted. And that is why his name will never be forgotten. *.